And
Gene, try that.
terrorism, no. Terrorism, I guess.
Yep, there we go.
We have.
That's right. I think that's good for the images. So it's wonderful. Oh, see, hold on. There we go. So we're in person. We'll get it back online no matter what. But no, it's great to be here in person with this group. I see familiar faces here and many familiar faces and names online. So this is a great privilege. It's been a long time since I've spoken to this group, so I'm happy to be here. Let me just. I need either the arrows or the page things. Should just
The arrows. Great.
no, let's just see. Hold on.
The learning curve. Mentions.
Let me try one other.
Yeah, this is the Zoom, not the.
Yeah.
Oh.
There's that. It might just be, we don't want it to be full screen.
Yeah.
Just see.
There you go.
Yeah. And what,
No.
see, but then they're seeing the slide.
They're seeing everything there. Let me this real little maybe.
Nice.
Okay, here we go. Yeah,
Okay.
okay. I think we got it. There's always a way. You just have to hit buttons in different sequences. So sparrows are, a challenging group for many people, and especially for beginning birders and people who have not been watching them all their lives. They can be very difficult because the traditional way of identifying birds is to look at the field marks that are denoted in the field guide and to try to line those up on the bird that you're seeing. But sparrows are often difficult to see. In fact, many of them spend most of their lives in habitats where you really have a hard time seeing them at all. In fact, I just, here's my one of my blurry photos of a Henslow sparrow, but I teach vertebrate zoology at the College of Staten Island, and my students are often shocked or amazed when I tell them that a huge majority of the terrestrial vertebrates that we have around us in our local environments belong to one species of salamander, one species of shrew, and two species of mice that none of them have ever seen any of them ever in their lives, because they simply inhabit a different space than we are familiar with. Sparrows are not quite that bad, but a lot of the time they are very difficult to see. So you have to learn certain sort of strategies that make your chances of seeing them and then recognizing the things that are important about them, just to increase the odds of those things. So other factors such as shape, behavior, the context in terms of date, location, and microhabitat, and especially being aware of age-related variation. All of these factors can come together to make it easier to make sense out of the little bits and pieces of sparrows that we sometimes see. And one thing which I find myself whenever I'm birding with other people of varying backgrounds is that a lot of people have difficulty distinguishing savanna and song sparrow. Both of them are common almost everywhere in New York. They're very widespread. They're familiar to us. We see them often, and yet their plumage patterns in terms of like where the black is, where the brown is, where the white is, all of those things about them are actually very similar. But in almost every other way, they're very different from each other. So for instance, you see just the length of the tail in relation to the body is quite different. Song sparrows have a long tail that they flop around quite a bit, whereas savanna sparrows have a short tail. They have a compact body shape. And their behavior, their patterns of occurrence, their seasonality, all of these habits are somewhat different from each other, even though they occur next to each other on our checklists all the time. So my talk is going to focus on ways of appreciating these beautiful birds. I mean, they really are among the most beautiful birds, in my opinion, by studying their shape, their behavior, and trends in their overall plumage patterns that help you to recognize groups of similar species. And these are my names I made up for them on the spot here for just lining up with the genus names. But the groups that I'm going to talk about tonight are the Spizella sparrows, which are small sparrows with relatively long tails in relation to their body size. The Melospiza sparrows, which are among the most familiar, that inhabit dense woody vegetation, thickets. The Zonotrichia sparrows, which have whistling songs that they perform even during the non-breeding season, because they travel together in flocks and they sing all through the year, like the white-throated sparrow. The savanna and vesper sparrows are a pair that don't really fit into other groups, but they occur in the same sort of places with each other, and they look somewhat similar. And then what I call the flatheads, which used to be called the Ammodramus sparrows. They've been broken up into several genera, but around here we have grasshopper sparrow, which Lindy mentioned having seen at Sunken Meadow, which is actually a very unusual thing to find them in migration away from their breeding grounds, and very often disorienting as a result of that. You don't expect to see it. And the rare Henslow sparrow. We on Long Island have several species of marsh sparrows now in the genus Ammospiza. And then there are several others that are less typical, and some other species that are often mistaken for sparrows. So beginning with the Spizella sparrows, I'll just take this opportunity to point out the overall shape of a Spizella sparrow is quite typical for a sparrow, but with a relatively long tail. You can see the plumage tracks that are described in field guides very well on them. For instance, you can see
on Zoom, the slide.
We are not seeing any slideshow going on. We see the.
Oh, they're not seeing the slides. I think we've got to.
We didn't see a thing in the last 5 minutes.
Okay. So we're going to go back. This is where the slides become important, but I'm going to escape here.
Okay, nothing's on the screen.
No, that's okay. We're trying to. No, it's not
No,
the
it's not the
connection. It's
connection.
not the connection.
It's the Zoom. Here,
Display
display
settings.
setting.
Yep, this. Swap presenter view and stage.
No, go back.
Okay. Let's see. New share. Let's try it.
One participant. We only want that. We don't want anybody else.
Okay, let's.
Are you seeing this?
Is that visible?
Yes, the long tail.
Yes.
Yes, it's visible.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so very, very good. So the introduction was really just showing you savannas and song sparrows, and then giving you the overview of the different groups of sparrows, and that's all coming through now. Okay, great. So the Spizella sparrows are illustrating the plumage tracks that you often see mentioned in the field guide. So for instance, those two little white wing bars that you see are the tips of the median coverts, the upper wing bar, and the greater coverts, the lower wing bar. And the presence or absence of distinctly contrasting white tips to those feathers are a major, major clue as to which group of sparrow you might be looking at. Another one, this is, for people who are experienced, this is sort of an obvious thing, but it's actually not all that obvious because it varies with age. But whether the bird has black or other dark streaking on the undersides of the breast and the belly or not is a major thing that you want to look for as well. So a field sparrow is a very, very subtly pretty bird. It doesn't have a large bill, but the color of the bill is important in the Spizella sparrows. They typically are unstreaked underneath, except in juvenile plumage, in which case they are streaked underneath. And they show this beautiful sort of contrast between their back plumage, which has complex markings of dark centered feathers and pale edges, and then a plain unpatterned rump. So this is a familiar species here with the pale bill and the white eye ring. But if you were to just see the bird on the left here from this angle, it might not be all that obvious what it is. You see a rusty cap. You might even think that it looks a little bit like a song sparrow. It's kind of puffy. It's got a long tail. You can't really tell whether it's streaked underneath. It isn't, in fact, but you do see certain features, like you see the white tips to the greater coverts forming a bit of a wing bar. You see that barring on the back contrasting with a pale unstreaked rump. You see the long tail. You see these beautiful tertials with their contrasting edges. And then you see one other thing I mentioned just a moment ago, almost in passing, that in this genus of sparrows, these long-tailed Spizella sparrows, the color of the beak tends to be very informative. And that yellow lower mandible tells you that it is a tree sparrow, an American tree sparrow, which is more obvious when you look at the photo on the right with the stick pin and the rusty cap. The lower part of the beak is yellow. And we're going to see that on another species in a moment as well. Now, people sometimes mistake the tree sparrow or they confuse the tree sparrow with the chipping sparrow. Chipping sparrow is one of the most common and widespread breeding sparrows around here. And in the winter, when people participate in Christmas counts, they often see sparrows that have a rusty cap, and they think that it is the familiar chipping sparrow. But chipping sparrows are actually quite uncommon in winter, especially on Western Long Island. And we want to, first of all, just ground ourselves. Let's recognize that this is a Spizella sparrow with a relatively long tail, with neatly tipped coverts forming little wing bars, and it's unstreaked underneath. And this plumage of the chipping sparrow is the breeding plumage, at which time they also have a distinctly black bill, giving them quite a distinctive appearance. But in the winter, when the possibility for confusing a tree sparrow with a chipping sparrow exists, chipping sparrows don't look like that anymore. Their bills now have a sort of a bland color, and they no longer have a distinctly reddish cap. They have a little bit of that color, but they have some streaking in their cap. And what else do we see about them? I see the relatively long tail on the bird, the upper bird. I see something of an eye ring, kind of like the field sparrow, but I see a dark line through the eye, which is different than the field sparrow. But I do see that plain, unmarked breast. I also see one more feature, which is quite informative, which is the contrasting gray nape. The area behind the cheek on this bird is contrastingly gray. That's a characteristic of chipping sparrows and also of a similar looking but less common species, the clay-colored sparrow. So in non-breeding plumage, the overall appearance of a chipping sparrow can be quite similar to that of the clay-colored sparrow, which is shown on the right here. But there are still a number of differences. Note first, though, the overall similarity in overall pattern and overall shape, with the long notched tail and the neatly patterned wing feathers and the panel of striped feathers on the back, contrasting with a paler rump. They both have the gray nape, but they have two distinct features that are quite easy to discern in life. And one is the area between the eye and the bill on the chipping sparrow on the left is dark, whereas the lores, the area between the eye and the bill on the clay-colored sparrow, is pale, and the rump on the clay-colored sparrow is clay-colored. It doesn't contrast in color tone with the brown tones of the upper parts, whereas on a chipping sparrow, the rump is contrastingly gray. Those details are things you don't have to memorize up front. You can just be aware of them. Once you've recognized that your bird falls into this group, remember that you want to look at details of the face pattern and the rump color. So I began by mentioning the nearly ubiquitous song sparrow, which is a bird that is familiar pretty much to all of us and the most numerous member of the genus Melospisa. Melospisa sparrows are very typical sparrows, I would think. They have variable amounts of streaking below. The swamp sparrow on the right has streaking below only to a limited extent, except in juvenile plumage, but it often does have a little bit of streaking below, which can invite confusion. The Lincoln sparrow on the left is heavily streaked below, quite similar in a superficial way to the song sparrow, but different, as I'm going to show you in just a moment. These birds, yeah, neither one of these is the song sparrow. Yeah, but they have sort of a shape which I think of as being sort of a typical sparrow shape. Their tails are not short. In the case of these two, their shape is very similar. Their tails are medium length, and they often show a little bit of a peak at the rear of the crown, whereas song sparrows have a longer tail, which, as you see in this image, they often flop around. They flop it to the side, they flop it up and down when they fly. And you can see that the streaking is relatively heavy on a song sparrow. So song sparrows, under certain conditions, can be difficult to distinguish from the Lincoln sparrow, which is shown here at the top. But I find that more often the difficulty comes in distinguishing Lincoln sparrows from swamp sparrows when you don't have a really excellent view, or it's difficult to distinguish the color tones very clearly. You'll notice that, like the two sparrows that we just looked at, these birds also show an unstreaked kind of grayish nape patch, which could be confusing. But look at the streaking underneath and look at the color and pattern of the wings. On these birds, they do not show wing bars. The coverts on the wings have dark centers and then brown edgings, which vary in tone from an almost olivey color on the Lincoln sparrow on the left to a distinctly very reddish color on a swamp sparrow. And that dark reddish color on the wings of a swamp sparrow, seen here below, is often a very, very good field mark that will get you in the right area for identifying the bird. The Lincoln sparrow above, as you can see, is, depending on the angle, the nature of those very bold but fine, relatively fine breast streaks might not be as easy to see, but the wings are not going to show that intensely red color that you would see on a swamp sparrow. One other thing that I'd like to point out in this image is to not get too hung up on the names of birds and not to get too hung up on the primary field mark of each species. So we're going to see our familiar white-throated sparrow in a minute, but you should be aware that the swamp sparrow, which is a very common bird at some times of year, has a distinct and boldly contrasting white throat as well. Song sparrow, in addition to the points that we've already mentioned, the streaking underneath coalesces in a thick black spot in the center of the breast. That's mentioned in all the field guides, but it's not always as obvious as it is in this image. But the streaking is thicker and more blurry than it ever is on the Lincoln sparrow. The tail is longer, and the area between the throat and the pale malar on the lower part of the face is often forming a very thick black triangle. That's a point of distinction from the otherwise similar savanna sparrow as well. Not in the same genus, but similar overall is the fox sparrow, which again is a streaked bird with reddish brown tones, really quite beautiful. It's one of our largest sparrows, but that's not always an obvious thing when you're in the field. But does everybody see an interesting field mark here? I noted it on the tree sparrow earlier, which is yellow tone to the lower mandible. So that feature is shared by the otherwise very dissimilar fox sparrow. But interestingly, modern research using molecular genetic comparisons has suggested that fox sparrows and tree sparrows are actually closely related to each other, something which I find difficult to believe based on my experience with the two of them, and their habits and their shape and manners are very different. But there is at least this one point of similarity where they have the yellow lower mandible. And I always work into all of my talks about bird identification, the importance of being receptive to unexpected things that are not typical, things that potentially might be rare or vagrant birds. So this is a fox sparrow that I photographed on the Montauk Christmas count, which is an example of the far northwestern. They breed all the way into Alaska and the Seward Peninsula, the subspecies Zaboria. It is in the same subspecies group as the red fox sparrows, but you can see how much grayer it is and how its streaking underneath is much blacker. So this bird in some ways is more similar to a song sparrow than a typical eastern fox sparrow. Another group of sparrows that often are among the most common that we encounter, they also, like the Melaspisa sparrows that we just were discussing, they often occur in or around the edges of woody vegetation, are the Zonotrichia sparrows. These are the ones that have the whistled songs that they often perform during the winter. The most familiar and numerous is the white-throated sparrow, which is illustrated here by a white-striped morph. There's also another genetic variant called the tan-striped morph, which is not nearly as boldly marked. But the white-throated sparrow is well named for its contrastingly white throat. But let's just take a look at some of the overall features of a Zonotrichia sparrow. One thing that you need to just take on faith or from your own experience is that they're relatively large compared to the things that we've been looking at so far, larger than a song sparrow, which in turn is larger than all the other species that we've talked about so far. And they do have wing bars. They have bold white tips to their covert edgings. And then like the Spizella sparrows, they show a pattern where they have a striped back in contrast with an unmarked rump, as you can see in this adult white crowned sparrow. They often, each of the species has a bold head pattern that differs from the others. And in the case of this young white crowned sparrow, it's possible, but not maybe obvious, to see the similarity in the head pattern. But what is easy to see is the overall Zonotrichia pattern of having a head pattern, a striped back, wing bars, an unstreaked, mostly unstreaked underparts, and then this unstreaked rump.
This is what bird is?
This is the white-crowned sparrow. Here's the young white-crowned sparrow again, showing all those features, including the plain unmarked rump. So again, what I'm trying to get at in terms of really familiarizing yourself with the overall similarities of each genus or each group is that knowing that this is what a Zonotrichia looks like can help you when you run into potential confusion. So one thing I like to point out is that this bird, if you didn't get a really good look at it, or if you were thrown off and had a misperception of its size, it actually looks a lot like a winter plumaged chipping sparrow, which is a tiny bird in relative comparison, but has a plain gray nape, has the contrast between the back and the rump. The rump on the chipping sparrow, you remember, is actually gray, so that's a little bit different here, but it's got the white tips to the coverts and so on. Often in the non-breeding season has sort of a pinkish tone to the bill. So you want to be aware of those things. You want to be aware that this is a large bird, that this is, larger than a song sparrow. And when you recognize those things, you're going to have to forgive me. Oh, first of all, you're going to recognize sometimes you're going to see something that looks very much like it, but definitely a little bit different. This is a Western North American Gambel's white-crowned sparrow in immature plumage, very similar to the Eastern white-crowned sparrow. But again, the area between the eye and the bill is important, or in this case, the area between the eye and the front of the head stripe is subtly dark on the Eastern birds, whereas it's pale gray. Do you see that? The area in front of the eye is all pale gray, and the bill color is different. It's really a yellowish orange in the Gambel's white crown, as opposed to the sort of pinkish color in the Eastern white crowns. And then you'll know that occasionally there's an even rarer bird, like this is a golden crown sparrow that showed up on Long Island a few years ago. Very similar overall in pattern to an immature white crown sparrow, but it lacks that color to the beak. The beak is quite a bit duller, and it lacks the stripes on the head that are quite distinct on the white crown sparrow. And then even the dullest immatures, if you get a very good look at the middle at the front of their crown, show this golden color. So on the left, again, to review, is a nice adult white crown sparrow showing all of its features. And on the right are two of my patented terrible bird photos of They're not as bad as some of my very favorite terrible bird photos of Pat's that I use all the time in talks of amazing rare birds that she's found. But this was a Harrison sparrow that she and I found in Baldwin Harbor Park on the Southern Nassau County Christmas count about almost 20 years ago. And can you see on that lower right-hand photo the distinctive pattern of a Zonotrichia sparrow with the unstriped rump, the striped back, then the unmarked nape, and then the details of the head pattern. Even on this poorly photographed, relatively unmarked immature bird, you see that there's some dark stuff, a big dark band on the back of the auriculars. And if you are very, very good at looking through murky vegetation, you'll see the side of the face of it showing some, quite a different pattern in the upper photo, and some streaking on the sides of the breast, which you'll never see on a white-crowned sparrow. So all four of those Zonotrichias have shown up. Two of them are common on Long Island, but the two rare ones are there, plus the Gambel's white-crowned sparrow to be discovered. So moving on from these towards a different kind of habitat, moving away from woody vegetation towards grasslands and open areas and marshes, I want to just take a couple of minutes to talk about the very common and widespread savanna sparrow, and the also widespread but much less numerous in New York Vesper sparrow. They can you see the difference in shape from the last several genera? The Spizella, Melaspisa, and Zonotrichia all have relatively longer tails than a savanna sparrow. And both the savanna and the Vesper sparrow in all of their plumages show streaking underneath. So looking at the wings of this savanna sparrow, first off, one thing that I can't emphasize enough is to not be overly swayed by your perception of color on sparrows. It can be a useful clue, but some species are incredibly variable geographically, individually, and seasonally in the actual color tones. Both of these are Eastern breeding savanna sparrows, and yet this one is so much more richly colored, partly because it's freshly molted during fall migration, whereas this one's on the breeding territories. But what you can see are aspects of their plumage pattern. For instance, this bird does not show the contrasting panels of unmarked, striped, and unmarked on the upper parts. It's more uniformly striped overall, and it does not show that contrasting pattern on the wing. The wing feathers, kind of like a song sparrow's in a way, have dark centers on the greater coverts, dark blackish centers with brownish edging, which you see on both of these birds, but without really contrastingly white tips to the feathers. And that is true even on this bird. Believe it or not, this bird is considered the same species as this bird. This is the Ipswich sparrow, which is a distinctive geographical population of savanna sparrow that is much paler, much larger, and quite different, or at least much more stereotyped in its habitat preferences. It's restricted to the outer coast, to our barrier beaches, basically to the dune line even. But it shows the same overall pattern of having the streaked upper parts and underparts and lacking contrasting patterning in the wings, short tail, etc. When I say that it lacks contrasting pattern in the wings, you might protest when you see these tertials, which are the three feathers that you see. They look sort of as though they're at the wingtip, but they're not. They're actually the innermost secondaries, and they lie on top of the folded wing in birds like this that don't have a very long wingtip, and really is the most contrasting part of the bird. But look at all the other features and line them up, and you'll find that it is a savanna sparrow, even down to the field mark that I haven't mentioned yet, which is pointed to in the Peterson guide and all the field guides, which is that in the pale band above the eye, savanna sparrows typically show yellow color. This one doesn't. So that's why I don't mention it, because it will let you down. This one does show the yellow in the supercilium, and this one shows a little lemony wash in the supercilium. So that is a characteristic of savanna sparrows, but sometimes it can be very difficult to see, especially in Ipswich sparrows. Another gray, striped, and streaked sparrow that can be, and often is in fact, confused with the Ipswich sparrow in our area is the Vesper sparrow. It's very widespread, and it basically occurs in all the same kinds of habitats that savanna sparrows do, meaning open country, agricultural fields, and the edges of the beaches and any kind of open area. But it's much less numerous than the savanna sparrow, and when they do occur on the outer beach, they often are posing a little bit of an ID problem, a potential ID problem with the Ipswich sparrow. But you can see two features immediately, I think, that will help you distinguish it from the similarly pale and gray Ipswich. And that is the bolder white ring around the eye, and also the bolder and more contrastingly tipped covert feathers on the wings, which are different not only from the Ipswich, but from regular savanna sparrows as well. Because sometimes these ones, with their streaked appearance and their relatively short tail and their habits around the edges of fields, they can be tricky to distinguish from savanna sparrows. So here's a photo of a more richly colored, or at least a seemingly more richly colored Vesper sparrow on the right, and with a savanna sparrow a little bit out of focus on the left. But note on the Vesper sparrow, again, the white eye ring being the most distinctive feature of the face, whereas on the savanna sparrow, the stripes on the face are the most obvious thing that you note about it. And then on the Vesper sparrow also, that it does show wing bars. It's got contrastingly paler tips to the covert feathers on the wings. Here's a Vesper sparrow in an outer beach setting, but showing its white eye-ring very well. There's also another thing about them is that you would never see an Ipswich sparrow in this kind of an upright posture. The Vesper might crouch or stand up, but Ipswiches almost always show a crouching posture. Sure.
Kind of stop a little bit abruptly.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. The character of the streaks on the breast and the underparts is sort of more defined than it is on the savanna, where they're often, showing a lot of streaks. Though, you can see that well on this photo, but you see the streaks continuing on the flanks. So if you see the bird, yeah, this one too, you can see that, but you don't always get an angle where you can get that distinction. But that is definitely true. And here's an Ipswich sparrow showing you that the streaking does kind of give out on the belly in this form of savanna sparrow as well. But again, the stripes on the face are more noticeable than the eye ring, and this one happens to show a nice yellow tone to the supercilium. So grasshopper sparrow and Henslow sparrow, these are among the more difficult to see, mysterious birds in a lot of ways. We on Long Island still have breeding grasshopper sparrows, but that may not be forever if, for instance, the grasslands in the Calverton area are further developed and fragmented. But the distinctive thing about these birds is their shape. They have a very short tail, often with markedly sort of pointed, spiky feathers to their tails. They have a large head relative to their body size, with a heavy bill that doesn't form an angle with their crowns. So they have a very distinctive head shape as a consequence of that. So I want to just ask Lindy, when your group found the grasshopper sparrow, was there, like, oftentimes when I've been with people and they see a grasshopper sparrow out of, in migration in a place where you see other sparrows more commonly, the first impression is field sparrow due to this sort of buffy color to the underparts and the white eye ring and the pale bill. Was there ID confusion, or was it recognized pretty readily? Yeah. Okay, so that's that's that very interesting. This one obviously is a lucky photograph, which is showing you a lot of stuff about it. They do have just amazing patterning to all of the feathers of their wings and upper parts. So if you look at the tertials, which are those broad sort of rectangular three feathers that are lying in two sort of vertical rows on the sides of the back, they're exquisitely patterned with almost like purple, maroonish colors, gray, rusty, and black. If you can get a photograph of that or see it clearly, the distinctive individual patterns of those feathers, the little reddish feathers that are trickling down on the back of the neck, those things are diagnostic species for species. Very similar in every way, except for the details, is the Henslow sparrow. Some of the details that are different are that the ground color of the face on the Henslow sparrow is green, which is unusual for a bird. It's got more black markings on the sides of its face, particularly on either side of that pale malar, which on the lower part of the face. And it also has distinct black streaking across the breast and on the flanks. Now, this is another case where I'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment, but you have to be wary of the fact that grasshopper sparrows in juvenile plumage lack some of the colorful features of the adult plumage, and they also have streaking underneath. It's a general theme. Everybody knows that baby robins have spots underneath, whereas adult robins don't. It's a general theme that many of the unstreaked species, like grasshopper sparrow, show streaking as juveniles. So it's interesting that your migrant grasshopper sparrow, you were actually able to see it and identify it in its normal habitat, which is within dense grass, where they basically cannot be seen unless you are extremely, extremely discerning or fortunate. But many of the grasshopper sparrows that are in fact found by birders in migration are birds that are out in the open. And they often behave the same way, like a little mouse that's hidden under the grass, even when they're out in the open, which is very disconcerting. Like, here's this grasshopper sparrow, it's not moving, it's right in front of me, it's totally out in the open. But it's not that it's characteristic of them, but when they get themselves into these sort of situations, they're more likely to be noticed by birders. Similar to those species are the group in the genus Amospisa, the marsh sparrows. Seaside and salt marsh sparrows are common breeding birds around here in our salt marshes, especially on the south shore of Long Island. And it's worth making a trip to go see them during the breeding season, just to familiarize yourself with them, because there are other species that are less numerous and that can show up in other kinds of contexts, like the Nelson sparrow and the LeConte sparrow. Overall, the seaside sparrow is larger than the other ones. It's dark and gray in general, though there is geographic variation. And I've actually seen and photographed birds on Long Island in the breeding season that look like individuals from much farther south. And I don't know whether that is evidence of, maybe possibly even vagrancy or just greater variability than people are generally aware of. But they have very long bills. The salt marsh sparrow is much smaller and much more brightly colored, though it does also, if you look at the shape of the bill, have a relatively long bill. And it is a sparrow that is definitely streaked underneath, and that in combination with its orangey color on the face with little black flecks in the rear of the supercilium is a fairly distinctive thing, especially in the breeding season when we don't have Nelson sparrows. But be aware that the appearance of salt marsh sparrows varies not only with age, but with season. This is a breeding bird in the middle of the summer whose color tones are much more muted than this freshly molted bird in fall migration. But you do still see the longish bill and the little black flecks in the supercilium, which tell you that it is not a Nelson sparrow, despite the sort of restricted or more worn streaking on the breast. Fortunately, Nelson sparrows occur here mainly in fall migration, when they are to be compared with the fresh breeding plumaged salt marsh sparrow. I'm sorry, freshly molted salt marsh sparrows. And you can see, in contrast or in distinction to them, they tend to show much less distinct black streaking on the underparts. And furthermore, the orangey color that they often show on the head and the bib has a bold, sharp contrast with the whiter belly below it. But if you look at these four different individuals, Pat was complaining about the one at the lower left as being, just very oddly colored. I didn't do anything to the camera or anything like that. It's what it shows you is that color perception, even by technology, has many pitfalls to it. They don't really look quite that color, but they can be quite intensely orange. But all four of these birds vary in the degree of streaking and the distinctness of the dark streaking in the bib. And some barely show any at all, whereas others show more streaking in fresh plumage than, for instance, the salt marsh sparrow does in worn summer plumage before they molt. But notice the distinction in terms of shape. The bill is shorter than on the salt marsh sparrow, and the supercilium, it always appears broader to me, the orange flaring out above and behind the eye. And that broad flaring orange supercilium does not have black flecks in it. It has at most sort of a grayish wash that you can see in a couple of the individuals, but never the black flecking that you see in typical salt marsh sparrows. Now, can you see the bird? It was actually unbelievable to see this bird almost at my feet, but you can see something here, right? You can see some white stripes with black stripes in between, and that's on the back of the bird. That's telling you that this is a little bit different than a salt marsh or a Nelson sparrow. You see the orangey supercilium, right? That's you see the little black eyeball now that you see the orange patch and a little black eyeball at the bottom of it. That orange supercilium is a clue that this belongs in that genus Amospiza. And then next to it is a very black stripe on the side of the head, and next to that is a very white stripe on the crown. So this is a LeConte sparrow. Oh, yeah, I will. So the bird is facing us. This is its eye. Oh, this is its cheek, and this is its crown. And white crown, black on the side of the head, and ochre there. This is its back with panels of black feathers with bright pale edging to them. And then you can see that it does have streaks on the flanks, bolder than you would on a Nelson sparrow. But the key identification feature is actually visible here, which is the white stripe down the middle of the crown. Once you've gotten it into this group, that absolutely tells you that it's not one of these. These have I didn't actually illustrate it super well, but you can see that the center of the crown is gray, broadly gray, nothing contrastingly pale. So LeConte sparrow is an extremely, is seen extremely infrequently, partly because it's rare and partly because it's difficult to see, being like these other grassland and marshland birds being, normally as invisible as a little meadow vole, which is, out there by the millions, but difficult to see. So the last group of species is a little bit of a grab bag of things that look like sparrows or are very unusual sparrows, like the green-tailed towhee at the lower left. The one above that in the upper left is a Lapland longspur. To the right of that, you might recognize the snow bunting, and on the lower right, you see a dickcissel. Dickcissels are actually occurring right now, as are in very small numbers Lapland longspurs. And I have not yet had my first snow bunting of the year, but usually right before Halloween, that's when they start showing up, and they'll be numerous on our outer beaches. I'll point out a couple of things about them. If you look at the tip of the folded wing on the three that are not the green-tailed towhee, you see that all three of these birds have very long pointed wings. You know that the wing is long and pointed because the folded tips of the primaries stick out beyond the tertials on the wing. So you see the little nested primary tips that each has a little pale edge as they stick out beyond there. Very prominent on the snow bunting on the upper right. If you see a pattern like that, you generally are not dealing with one of our common sparrows, because most of our sparrows are not super long flyers and don't have such long pointed wings. For other species that are not sparrows, but which are often mistaken for our Passarellidae family sparrows, are house sparrows. So beware of the house sparrow, because it can look an awful lot like a pale or poorly marked dickcissel on the lower right here. And then several kinds of blackbirds, with a bobolink on the lower left, a juvenile brown-headed cowbird on the lower right, and a female red-winged blackbird on the upper right. And it is no shame and no surprise that these blackbirds get mistaken for sparrows. It happens routinely, and it even happens to very famous birders. I've seen situations where there have definitely been situations where bobolinks, you see the bobolink on the lower left. The photo doesn't show you that the center of the crown is contrastingly pale next to the black on the crown, but it actually looks like a juvenile LeConte sparrow, except that it's like 2.5 times as big. But size is really, really difficult to judge. And I've seen expert birders arguing over photos of a claimed LeConte sparrow that turned out to be a bobolink, and even really, really good people, getting down into the weeds of the patterns of individual feathers before they really convinced themselves that this is a member of a completely different family than what people thought it was. So the green-tailed towhee is a rare vagrant. I've never even seen it in New York. That photograph was taken in Rhode Island, where I've seen it twice, oddly, but nothing really looks like an Eastern towhee. Not an ID problem in general, though still worth getting to know its call notes, so that if it's buried in the thicket, you know what it is and don't have to invest a lot of time to get a look at it if it's not cooperating. But then, of course, there always is an exception, and Baldwin Harbor Park strikes again. Pat and I, doing this a couple of years ago, had a towhee pop up in front of us, and much excited discourse and expletives, because this one was, in fact, a spotted towhee, where you can see the spotting on the back and on the scapulars and on the wing coverts on a couple of these very, very bad photos. But it's always a great pleasure to have to take lots of terrible photos of a great bird. Our slate-colored junco is mostly unmistakable in terms of its overall appearance, but it is a sparrow. And in fact, I encourage everybody to pay attention to them, listen to them, watch them past the point where you know what it is. In fact, that's always a key point in bird study, is don't stop looking at the bird once you know what it is. Watch it even more at that point, because at that point, everything you learn about it, you're lining it up with a firm identification and a name, and the associations will stick with you much better. Let's just look at it as though it was not this beautiful, subtle gray and white thing. To me, although it's in a different genus, it reminds me of a Spizella sparrow in terms of being slim with a long tail. It has a beak that the color of the beak is striking, and their call notes and their song reminds me of Spizella sparrows in a number of ways, and their behavior does. They, for instance, do something that not all sparrows do, as I'll mention later. They occur in the non-breeding season. They occur in flocks, distinct, obvious flocks of interacting individuals. Another oddball is the lark sparrow. It really is quite striking looking. If you see the underside of the tail, it looks white. That's because the outer tail feathers, which are the visible ones on the folded tail from underneath, show a lot of white. They have this bold, impossible to describe face pattern with panels of black and white and chestnut and brown. And they show a little black stick pin on an unstreaked breast. So a well-marked lark sparrow is not difficult to identify. Even a less well-marked one is pretty easy to identify, but I like to make this point because I hear people talking about the age of lark sparrows a lot. For instance, this one would probably be called an adult by many, and this one is clearly a bird of the year, but based on the fact that it is showing numerous small little flecks on the breast, which are retained remnants of its juvenile plumage. But I point out the fact that these birds, like many of our birds, engage in a molt between their breeding season and their migration season, in which the young birds replace varying numbers of their feathers. So in all likelihood, all of these lark sparrows are young birds, just some of them are more completely molted and more adult looking than others. Now we get to our photo quiz part of the day. A good friend of mine once told me that anybody want to guess what this bird is? And there's no shame in not knowing what it is.
Lark bunting?
It's a lark bunting. It's a lark bunting. When I came to Long Island in 1996, there had been one at Robert Moses State Park like the year before. And so I heard a lot about it. That's where the lark bunting was, as I'm walking by. One of the people who tortured me in that way actually confessed to me that he had seen the bird before it was found and identified by Dave Mizrahi, who's a New York birder who's now well known in New Jersey. He's worked for New Jersey Audubon for many years. But my friend had seen the bird, said, "What is that?" It's like, "What is it?" And he went on, and then fortunately, a short time later, it was found and identified. And sheepishly, everybody went back and got their state or life lark bunting. I did see this one found by Brent Baumkamp at Robert Moses, and this was my first, though, in New York State, found by Doug Futuma, again at Robert Moses. So that little patch of habitat has had, as more or less, the last three lark buntings on Long Island, which proves the point of things can be very rare, but that doesn't mean that they're accidental. There's a patterning to their occurrence. The key to identifying it is to see the very big, heavy bluish bill, the streaked underparts, and the extensive white paneling on the wing coverts. Okay, so we've gone through all of our species, and I'm going to just go quickly through two other angles. One is age, and the other is context for helping you to get to the right bird. Juvenile plumages of sparrows are very difficult to master. They're not held for very long towards the end of the breeding season, and they often look different from the adult of their own species and similar to the juveniles and even to the adults of other species. So that's a tough recipe. That bird, in case you did not recognize it in the first slide, was actually a juvenile song sparrow, as is this one. In this case, with a little bit more information, particularly about the shape of it, the long floppy tail and the big, thick, almost triangular black wedge between the throat and the mailer, you can recognize it as a song sparrow. It lacks, for instance, that yellowish supercilium of a savanna sparrow, etc. But it does not, the streaking underneath is much finer and does not coalesce into a big central spot like in the adult bird. And how about this one? Does anybody recognize this juvenile sparrow? So look at the wing coverts and look at just the color tone on that portion of the wing that you can see. So Savannah's not a bad guess because it is streaked. It's very well streaked, but this is a swamp sparrow. It doesn't have it's all striped underneath. The streaking actually looks like that of a juvenile Lincoln sparrow, even a little bit like an adult Lincoln sparrow. But do you remember that the swamp sparrow had that rich chestnut color on its wing feathers? And that's a clue. But I include this to show you that there are places in the Adirondack Mountains where you can, from the very same spot, see juvenile swamp sparrow, juvenile Lincoln sparrow, juvenile song sparrow, and juvenile white-throated sparrow, all in the same place, and they all look remarkably similar with streaks underneath and different from the adult plumage. So a humbling experience and something that should be an inducement to closer study. everybody can see that this is a baby bird, right? Because you see the gape, you see the soft, brightly colored yellow gape. And really almost everything else about it is difficult to line up with the parental bird. The species is one that I told you had a long tail, but this bird's tail is not even fully grown yet, so it looks short. This species shows white tips to its wing coverts, so it has wing bars, but this bird's wing coverts are not grown in yet. You can't even see wing bars. You do see, though, a hint of a gray nape and a back that is striped brown and black, and a little bit of chestnutty tone to the crown, and a dark line through the eye. This is, in fact, a juvenile chipping sparrow, but heavily streaked underneath, and not very different looking from a juvenile clay-colored sparrow, or even a juvenile field sparrow can be confusing when you see them very, very young. Now, this is a bird like the chipping sparrow that we all are likely to encounter as a juvenile, but it could really throw you if you did not get a good look at, see on the tail is long and brown with big white patches on the outer tail feathers, and there's a towhee. This is a towhee in full juvenile plumage. The lesson here is to study all of your birds all of the time so that you become familiar with the different plumages, but to also really focus in on shape and structure, because they are less variable and less prone to cause confusion when you really get used to the appearance and manners of a bird. And then finally, here are our two breeding species of marsh sparrows, seaside and salt marsh sparrows, neither of which really looks at all like the adult. And in fact, the upper two images are showing you juvenile seaside sparrows, and the lower left image is showing you a juvenile salt marsh sparrow. And then there's one of each with the face conveniently blocked on one of them in the lower right. But that juvenile seaside sparrow is very unfamiliar to many birders and causes a lot of confusion. Instead of just a big, dull gray bird with a yellow spot in the lores, like the adult seaside sparrow, it's got all this plumage patterning to it and streaking underneath, etc. And meanwhile, this salt marsh sparrow is this bright orange bird, very limited streaking underneath. It looks in some ways like what you might expect a Nelson sparrow to look like, but then again, remind yourself, Nelson sparrows don't occur during June and July and August when juvenile marsh sparrows are around. So the last topic is context, which is that there are many clues that are available to us that are not a feather by feather analysis. Date, location, microhabitat, behavior, the way the bird interacts with the ground and the things that it perches on, its degree of sociality, all of these things are strong, strong markers of individual species and groups of species. So here's a lark sparrow in a little patch of short grass, sandy substrate with invasive weeds around it. Where is that habitat found? Little weeds and grass. It's found everywhere, everywhere. And yet, this bird is a common, very widespread breeder in 2/3 of North America, if you look at its range map. And yet it's a rare bird in New York. And when it occurs in New York, it does not frequent the habitat that it frequents in its breeding grounds. It does not frequent the habitat that it prefers, which is this habitat. In the vast majority of places where it occurs throughout the state, it always or almost always occurs within sight or sound of the ocean. Why that is, I do not know, but it is a fact that if you check it out on eBird, from Fort Tilden to Jones Beach to Robert Moses, that is where you find lark sparrows. And you find them from August to October. I mean, things are changing a little bit. You see them a little bit more often late in the season than formerly, but it's got, for a rare bird, its pattern of occurrence is remarkably stereotyped. I mean, I look for them in literally a certain little verge of vegetation every year, and I find them there every year at Robert Moses. And, you know, by the same token, here's an Ipswich sparrow on its grass of choice, which is Ammophila, beach grass, and they're found on the very outermost coast in winter. And that is you know, it helps guide you to the right identification. Another feature, which for this audience, I'd like you to take stock of, is the occurrence of this grass, which is called Panicum amarum, or bitter panic grass. And it is it's very patchily located on Long Island, usually on the outer beach. And it is just a magnet for many species of sparrows and other species of birds. So for instance, the Spizella sparrows, like the clay-colored sparrow on the upper right. Do you see the clay-colored sparrows contrasting gray nape, unstreaked underparts, pale lores, the little neat wing bar? The Melospiza sparrows, like song sparrows, Lincoln sparrows, and swamp sparrows. That's a swamp sparrow on the upper left. You see that intensely red wing. That's and a only vaguely streaked underparts. Melospiza, Spizella, and Zonotrichia, things like white crown sparrows, like to feed in this, as do dickcissels. That's a dickcissel on the bottom left, and blackbirds. All of our locally common redwings and brown-headed cowbirds, and even the rare yellow-headed blackbird will take advantage of this plan. But other species will not. I've never yet seen a grasshopper sparrow or one of those flat-headed sparrows getting up into the seed heads of panicum. And these are snow buntings, which are abundant in that very habitat of the outer beach. And I have seen them settling into panicum, but very rarely. In general, they prefer to feed on the ground, and each species has its own preferences in those ways. A couple of other examples of this that I think will be familiar to many of you. You could be stopped in your car with the windows rolled up, and you see a small brown bird fly up from the ground to the very top of a small tree and immediately throw its head up and begin singing. If you see that, you don't need to see a field mark on it or to hear even part of the song to know that that's a song sparrow. It's extremely characteristic behavior. You, of course, don't want to report a song sparrow where it's rare without pinning down more details, but in your own birding, you'll recognize that you know a lot more than you might think. So if you're driving down a rural road with lawns or farmland and hedges and shade trees, and you see a small bird fly up from the side of the road, hitch upwards, and then land in the lower branches of a big shade tree, that is quintessential behavior of our common breeding Spizella, the chipping sparrow. Conversely, if you're working on your sparrow and you've got some sparrows in the grass in a sort of wilder setting, you're trying to see them and you're moving around, and the bird flushes and flies up. If it flushes out of thick grass and lands in a tree or on a fence post, it's probably not a grasshopper sparrow or a Henslow sparrow or a marsh sparrow. It's probably a savanna sparrow. They are a grassland bird that does have the habit of perching out in the open when they get startled, whereas the other ones almost always will fly a little distance and then drop back into the dense grass and start walking away from you so that you're particularly unable to see them. And then finally, I mentioned sociality, and sociality is something that I'm sure you've observed in sparrows. So which of these 4 familiar species, and I'll name them if in case the images are not instantly recognizable. Which of them occur in flocks? We have a white-throated sparrow in the upper left, the song sparrow in the upper right, white crowned sparrow in the lower right, and swamp sparrow in the lower left. White throats occur in flocks. I mean, it's such a characteristic thing. They're around now, and they will be around all winter and into the spring. And you hear them singing, and that little chuckling sound that they make as they're scratching in the leaves. They occur in flocks, and their congener in Zonotrichia in the lower right is the white crowned sparrow, and they also occur in flocks. The only problem is on Long Island, they're not very numerous, so that behavior is not as obvious here. But if you've traveled out west, I'm sure you've seen flocks of white crowned sparrows, and you can even see them on Long Island in places where they do occur in numbers, like on eastern Long Island, in some of that agricultural country. In contrast, song sparrows, despite being one of our most abundant sparrows overall in terms of overall abundance, they don't really occur in flocks, and neither do their congener, the swamp sparrow, again showing you that intense rich reddish brown color in the lower left photo. They can be extremely numerous, but so that you see many of them, but they're only loosely associating with each other, not forming discrete flocks. And then finally, last quiz question is, which of the other sparrow genera form flocks? How about Spizella sparrows, field sparrows and chipping sparrows and tree sparrows? Do they? They do. In fact, and field sparrows do too, and tree sparrows do too. They've just gotten to the point where they're no longer numerous in the winter. This is actually something which is, is a little bit of alarming. But when I was a kid birding in the early 1980s in Rhode Island, which is just a little bit north of here, tree sparrow occurred in flocks like juncos. I mean, and so junco is the other one, which obviously occurs in large flocks. Tree sparrows have become much less numerous as wintering birds here, and it's simply that their wintering range is retreating north with a warming climate. But yes, the Spizellas do, and juncos do, and that is another clue to look for other kinds of unusual species entrained with them. You're going to want to look for things that are showing a similar mode of occurrence, similar sort of microhabitat preferences, and similar patterns of behavior. So that is it for the slides. If anyone has any questions, I'd be more than pleased to answer them. I think there'll be some coming in on the chat probably.
In the slideshow.
Well, on a graphic standpoint, the way you took some of the photos to try to bring it out, because the birds are so difficult to get. You were using like sepia tones and gray tones and.
I say this proudly that I am not a photographer. I am a birder who uses photographic equipment grudgingly. So most of my photos are actually taken with an iPhone or a little point and shoot digital camera through my scope. So my optical equipment of choice is my binoculars and my scope. And I'll take photos through that. I do have an old Canon EOS 10, which I haven't even used in a few years. But some of the photos were taken with an SLR. But no, I did not manipulate. All of those photos are the best that I was possibly able to represent the reality of it, with all of the obvious failures that go into it.
Are there, okay, what's the etymology of sparrows?
That I do not know where the word sparrow comes from. I will say that I'm sure that it's an Old English word, and the old Germanic languages actually are very good in terms of having, specific, very old names for different kinds of birds and other kinds of wildlife, which is a highly variable thing from culture to culture. But our language does have many, many ancient words for birds, and I believe sparrow it falls into that category.
I would mention that one of the things I've noticed is that even though they don't flock, is that those flocks of whitethroats tend to suck other sparrows into them.
Oh, yeah. So yes. So when you whitethroats form these nuclei, these flocks, and you very often will find a song sparrow or a swamp sparrow or a field sparrow or some other sparrow sort of entrained with them or taking advantage. Individual birds will definitely take advantage of the social environment where they have other birds around that are sentries and more eyes to detect predators and so on. Safety in numbers. So but there is a difference. You pay attention to it and see if you agree with me. There's a difference between having 8 or 10 song sparrows strung out across a little patch of habitat. They probably are not traveling together consistently over time and moving from spot to spot the way that a roving flock of chipping sparrows or juncos really hang together and maintain much tighter proximity to each other.
Any other questions from our Zoom audience?
Okay, let me
take you. Yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
Do sparrows want us to feed them in the winter? Should we agree to?
This reminds me of something that I was asked earlier today as a potential problem question for me, which is what's the best kind of bread to feed sparrows? So I'm going to turn it around on you. And of course, the answer to the joke is cheap bread, but the real answer is probably don't feed them bread. That's probably not the best thing. My view of bird feeding is that there are great advantages to people's pleasure in birds and enhancing their opportunity to learn more about birds. I know that there are pros and cons in terms of the overall welfare of wildlife when you give them supplemental food. I'm not convinced that the harm of it is on a scale that outweighs the benefits of engaging people with them. So I think if you enjoy it, it's worth doing. I see a more technical, a plumage related question here about the white-crowned sparrow having a distinctive immature plumage in its first winter of life, and whereas many species of sparrows do not have that. In fact, really, it's unusual. It's common for many kinds of sparrows to have a different appearance. So, for instance, I can usually tell first winter swamp sparrows from adult swamp sparrows by details of the color tone of their upper parts and their faces and their underparts. The same thing is probably true for chipping sparrows, I can usually tell, but they're not distinctly different looking, which is in fact the case for both white crowned sparrows and also golden crowned sparrows. So I don't know what the significance of that is.
So say, what dates do the fall sparrow migration season start and end around New York City, Long Island region?
So the good news is we are in the middle of it right now. So it is really, I think of it as October being sort of the very peak of it. There are species that begin migrating a little bit earlier than that. For instance, Lincoln sparrows start to move in late September. Chipping sparrows, actually not chipping sparrows, but Lincoln sparrows begin moving a little bit earlier. But October is the peak of the movement, and it definitely goes on into November. And don't forget also that given our position, almost everything that winters in Eastern North America, in other words, things that don't go all the way to the tropics, almost every species that winters here, even Lincoln sparrow being one of the longer distance migrants, occurs here at least rarely in winter. So going back to good old Baldwin Harbor Park, Pat and I have had Lincoln sparrow on the Southern Nassau County Christmas count more than once, and that's a pretty good bird on the Christmas count. But most of the species that I was showing you here that migrate through in good numbers are definitely present through November and often even into the winter in small numbers.
There's a cute question that says,
Is there a pecking order at the feeder?
That I'm sure is true. Yes, and we don't have a bird feeder at our condo. It's against the rules and so on, and but I do. I've fed birds at various times in my life, and absolutely there are going to be consistent patterns of birds displacing other birds from feeding opportunities. But I'll turn that around slightly and focus it back onto my discussion of the sort of behavioral context angle, which is if you have bird feeders, you'll definitely notice the ground feeders versus the platform feeders versus the perch feeders. So anything that feeds on the ground will probably come to a platform feeder, but they might prefer to feed on the ground, and most of them will feed on the ground, but they'll come to a flat platform. But maybe some of them, you will never see them up on the perches of a tube feeder, for instance. Whereas the opposite of that is the converse of that is probably less well marked. There are species that prefer to feed on a perch, like a goldfinch, for instance, but most things that prefer the perches or chickadees and titmice and things like that, most of them will resort to the ground as well, because that's obviously a very important thing in the natural environments of most of these species. But I mean, I remember when I was a kid, seeing juncos on the tube feeder was like only after a blizzard, when the ground was completely covered. They would, go up onto it, and they'd be very awkward and not comfortable, easily startled away.
So what's the story between the tan versus white striped whitethroats?
Yeah, so I mentioned it, but I did not explain it. It's actually one of the most amazing things in biology. So without going way into it, I'm going to leave that to my friend Doug to explain the full evolutionary context of it. It's unusual among organisms like ourselves, mammals and birds and reptiles. It's unusual to have a genetic variation. Like imagine like the red screech owls and the gray screech owls, or the gray morph eastern gray squirrels and the melanistic morph eastern gray squirrels. Though in those cases, a given population might have both variants present in it, but the proportions of those variants don't remain stable over time. One of them will either be favored over the other one or the other will be favored in rise in frequency. Or if they're exactly equally matched, one of them will just replace the other one by sheer chance in general. That's sort of a basic rule in ecology. So to have a genetic polymorphism, white stripe and tan stripe, exactly 50-50 in all populations of white-throated sparrows, stable over time. If it deviates, it comes, natural selection pulls it right back. There is a reason for it. And the reason for it is they are completely disassortative maters. They only mate with individuals who are unlike themselves. It's not associated with sex. Males can be either white morph or tan morph. Females can be white morph or tan morph. But an individual white-throated sparrow will choose as its mate an individual of the opposite sex that has the opposite genetic polymorphism for them. And there are behavioral things that are associated with it: aggressiveness, devotedness to the young, and so on and so forth. The white stripe morph is more aggressive, less attentive, etc. Among females as well as among males.
Shai, thank you. Outstanding presentation.
Nice.
All right.
You know, please know you have a choice to wear a mask, no mask, but thank you and please keep coming. The next month, I do believe we're all members and it's a members night and it's totally
No, it's a hybrid.
it's a hybrid. So you can come here and see it, or you can see it at home at your leisure. And
Yeah.
Harrison sent their photos of various birds to Jennifer and she has an announcement.
Yes, as reminded here, an unpaid political announcement. Please don't forget to flip your ballot and vote yes on Proposition 1, the Environmental Bond Act. And also a quick Google finds the word sparrow from Middle English, from Proto-West Germanic, sparrow, from Proto-Germanic, sparrow, and then from Proto-Indo-European spur. So there you go.
Yes.
It's an old word.
I have sightings at Sparrows, places around the museum on Lake Gold.
Night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.